Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Reverend Kosho Finch.
All right, so we are now on episode 4 of True Words, a Shingon Buddhist podcast. And the topic this time is going to be what's available for lay Shingon practitioners.
Well, that's probably one of the questions I get most often. I think as we mentioned a little bit in the last podcast, most of the books and things like that available about Shingon come from a scholarly perspective and probably don't focus on what you'll see if you walked into a Shingon temple or the type of practice that is happening, shall we say, on the ground by the average person. So it would probably be good to review some of those different methods and what kind of practices are there.
So I'm going to assume that a lot of these are going to be practices that we touched on in the previous 2 episodes. Things like chanting, making offerings, lots of bowing, sutra copying, and different practices like that. And like you said, flower arranging and different cultural arts as well. So how does that play in terms of Shingon practice?
So obviously the tradition, like most other Mahayana Buddhist traditions, has all of those features and things available. I think what you'll see, what I've noticed in Shingon, so as an American, I sometimes have an outsider view, even though I'm technically an insider. You'll see more variety between temples, perhaps in Shingon, than in other traditions. So the main image, the structure and layout of the temple, what the main practice that is done varies quite a bit, even in the same state and sometimes even in the same town. So of course, the place where we have the most Shingon temples is in the state of Hawaii. So you may have 3 or 4 temples in the same city, and on a given day, their practices may be roughly 70% the same, but you may see quite a significant amount of a difference that is due to that local temple's history, or depending on what Buddha statues are enshrined at that temple, you may see different mantras practiced or different sutras chanted. So there's actually quite a bit of a variance between the temples versus maybe some other religious traditions.
Okay. Unfortunately, I haven't been to Hawaii yet, so what kind of practices are there? What is it that most people would see when they walk into a temple?
Probably the biggest one, if you were to go to the average service, would be, I guess what in English we might describe as the lay service order. And Thankfully that's been translated into English. But what you probably will see as a variation are the mantras that are chanted. Generally, there are quite a few more added to the practice. So as a group practice, people would start with bowing, and then the head priest at that temple would lead those who've come to the service in the practice. So leading them through the mantra practices, the repentance, chanting of the Heart Sutra, and then various mantras that are chanted there. What's probably going to be different is if there's a period of meditation and the length of that meditation, and depending on the history and tradition at that particular temple, you may find that the goeka or choir is an active part of that temple. So you'll usually anywhere between 5 to sometimes up to 20 or more people assemble to go through and practice the religious song. And that's in Shingon practice with a bell and kind of chime or cymbal. And it's quite beautiful, quite melodic. Actually, in Japan, there's a lot of concerts for that style of religious singing. As a Westerner, I had to learn it, and initially I didn't quite. I could say it wasn't at the top of my list of interested practices. But actually, after learning a little bit, I really saw the benefit as a type of breathing meditation. So some of the notes are quite long, learning the breathing control, and then just reading or understanding the lyrics to some of the songs is actually quite beautiful as part of the Buddhist teaching. So it's an opportunity to practice the teaching, both from a, I guess, written or literary format, and then actually putting it into practice as a form of meditation.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's say that there is someone who does not live near a Shingon Buddhist temple. So I'm supposing that they could probably start with the lay Buddhist service, right? The standard one that you just mentioned. But other than that, what's available? And I mean, if they've never been to a service before, they don't know how that service really works either.
Yeah, so that is a limitation that we have right now. So there's only on the mainland U.S. probably a handful of temples, and unfortunately they're all on the West Coast. But I would encourage people, if they have an opportunity to visit one of those cities, to drop by and at least hear the service. One of the projects I want to work on is to get a copy, a recording of the service online, so people can at least hear it and maybe follow along, so they know what the mantras sound like. But that is, available for people to practice, and is quite commonly seen or commonly practiced in Japan as well. So people would go to the temple, and the books or the service orders available for people to practice at home. So in the beginning, practicing slow is fine. The speed isn't important. Just doing some kind of practice, but that kind of recitation practice is quite common. The other practices that are available, and usually it would kind of come out of interaction with one of the temples or one of the teachers, would be one of the meditation methods. So the accessibility or availability of that education or that opportunity would depend on the temple you went to. So some of the temples, the primary language spoken there is going to be Japanese, so there may be a language barrier. But most of the ones on the mainland U.S. anyway, you're going to encounter someone who speaks English. So there would be generally an opportunity to, and I believe I'm correct when I say that all of the temples on the mainland do offer meditation classes. So there would be an opportunity then to engage in or learn some of the meditation methods as well.
Okay. Although in regards to the general Shingon service, it's mostly filled with mantras, and then there is the Heart Sutra, which isn't a very easy sutra to understand either. So at least one of the challenges that I had when I was first starting it was trying to make sense of the service, because the mantras don't make sense in English or Japanese or Chinese, and if you go back to the Sanskrit, even after you translate it, it's still kind of jumbled up.
That's true. Well, the service has a particular structure, and that structure is, I think, common to most all Buddhist services, regardless of tradition, starting with the bowing, then going into taking of refuge and repentance and those kind of ideas. So there's sort of how does the person prepare themselves to receive the teaching, recognizing that there is some aspect of themselves that can be improved. And I think that's important, just conceptually, when we do any type of spiritual practice, that we're not doing it to make ourselves better than other people, but to discover something lasting or true about ourselves, rather than creating a situation where we're holding ourselves above others. Then we, especially in the Shingon tradition, engage with the Heart Sutra. So as we mentioned a little bit in the previous podcast, the Heart Sutra is expressing the wisdom teachings of the Buddha, the Prajnaparamita texts or classification of literature within Buddhism. And so the Heart Sutra is a pretty unique text amongst all the Buddhist texts. First, it's quite short, but it's spoken not by the Buddha, but by Avalokitesvara, Kanon, the Bodhisattva of compassion. And there's a couple different ways to look at it. You can look at it or read it as a teaching, as a text, so this is what you should understand. Or if you kind of read it in context, this text discusses that Avalokitesvara was in meditation. And in many ways, it's describing the Bodhisattva's experience. So immediately coming out of meditation, Avalokitesvara says, this is my experience. So by chanting the Heart Sutra, to some degree, we're both practicing the Buddha's words, but we're also getting into the same state of mind or place of mind that the Bodhisattva was in when they had the experience. So this, I think, is probably very common in Shingon teaching, is rather than seeing an ideal outside of yourself and learning all about it so that you can emulate it, you actually try to mimic it in a way, or really get into it and have it become part of you. So often in the mainland, the Heart Sutra may be chanted only one time. In more traditional settings in Hawaii, Japan, sometimes the Heart Sutra is chanted 3, 7, or more times. So that portion of the service actually becomes a meditation. There's a certain repetition. You're usually practicing with others. So you hear your voice, you hear the voice of others, and you're really getting into the experience of that bodhisattva. Of course, initially, you're not going to have that experience. Well, I didn't. Hopefully, our listeners will be lucky enough to have the enlightenment on the first time they chant the Heart Sutra. But over time and with practice, I think you begin to see the text in different ways, different perspectives, and it becomes a little less cryptic. But it is, because it is a short text, it is a distilled teaching, it has to be thought of more as an outline rather than a text that you can read once and come away with a tremendous amount of understanding.
Oh yeah, definitely. At least the first time I chanted the Heart Sutra, it was really confusing because, well, first off, it has all of the emptiness is form and form is emptiness kind of thing, and emptiness is not form or not different from form, and form is not different from emptiness, and all of these things that made my brain melt. And then it later on continued to say that there is no suffering, no cause of suffering, no extinction of suffering, and no way to extinction of suffering. And I was thinking, as a beginning Buddhist, this is totally the opposite of what I just learned 2 weeks ago.
Well, one thing to realize about the Heart Sutra, or about Buddhist teaching in general, is the Buddhist telling us that the way we see the world, the way we experience the world, isn't really how the world operates or the way the world looks. So the Heart Sutra is the Bodhisattva's experience and telling us how they see it. So because it's not our experience, of course it's cryptic. So the idea of chanting it, experiencing it, copying it, reading it, reciting it, with repetition, is that eventually we get a little bit closer to their experience, which is, of course, the goal of Buddhist practice. But it is confusing in the beginning, but perhaps that confusion is beneficial, because a lot of our obstacles, the Buddhist teaching tells us, is the result of our over-intellectualization of everything. We structure things, we order things, we put things in categories, and a large portion of the Buddhist teaching is telling us that, in fact, that's setting up more obstacles for us. That's causing us problems. That's really the thing that we need to deconstruct. And when we read a text like the Heart Sutra, we get this sort of immediately upon telling us it is one way, it tells us it's the other way. And as a classification of literature, as wisdom text, we can't understand it directly anyway, with our sort of intellectualized Western education model of thinking, that we can read it and make some notes on it and understand that teaching right away. It is something that does take time. And in that way, it is just like meditation. It's something that takes time. It unfolds over time. Its quality and facets become more obvious over time. I can say from my own experience studying the Heart Sutra for 20 plus years, it's something that I have a deeper understanding of than I did in the first 10 years, the first 15 years. So it does mature, I guess, in us after practicing it rather than just reading it.
Gotcha. So earlier when you were mentioning that the Heart Sutra is very much condensed, I feel like that's very similar to the conception of mantras, where it's definitely the experiences of the bodhisattvas and the Buddhas, and it's being expressed in these very short phrases. Well, sometimes a bit longer, but usually, especially in the usual Buddhist service, it's pretty short.
It is. So mantras are even shorter. So of course, in the Buddhist tradition, we have sutras, dharanis, and mantras. So of all of the vocalized practices or literature, the mantra is going to be the shortest. And again, I guess as a purely American example, a mantra is kind of like instant coffee. It stands for something, it represents something, but a lot of things have been taken out. But on the other hand, it's also very strong. So if you were to eat instant coffee without adding water, without stirring, it probably is not very tasty. But it includes everything that coffee has. Mm-hmm. It's just simplified in a way.
And of course, I would never drink that straight up out of the package. Definitely add some water first.
Right, you want to add some water. So if you're trying to intellectualize a mantra, it requires a little bit of reverse engineering. You got to add water, stir it, add the right amount of water. So it has to be maybe studied backwards. But on the other hand, the mantra is supposed to be the words of the Buddha. It may include the name of a Buddha, which oftentimes the sutras say is sort of the key to understanding that Buddha's vows, which, of course, the vows of the Buddhas are generally very important in terms of their own path to enlightenment. So in that way, I think the mantra can be looked at on the intellectual side as something that's very strong, something very powerful, in the same way that instant coffee is very strong. So by practicing it, turning it over, reciting it, we come to understand the teaching, again, from not an intellectual side. So a lot of things in Buddhist practice are getting us out of that intellectual or over-intellectualized perspective. Bowing is the same way, making offerings. Some of the things at first glance seem paradoxical, or it may not be so obvious why we're doing it, but it's something that matures in us over time and takes on meaning. I think you can think of it the same way as in sports. When I was in high school, I ran track, and we did a lot of exercises that I didn't immediately understand the need for. And then later on, when we got closer to competition, I understood the benefit. Or we would do certain drills or exercises, and we dreaded it. We all just wanted to go out and run our events. But I think in many ways, mantra practice is one of those. And on a kind of very practical note, mantra practice is a form of meditation, and is something that's available to us when seated meditation may not be. You can practice mantras while you're walking, biking, driving. You can practice mantras when you have a very strong emotional state. It may be difficult to get into a meditative state when you're beset by grief or anger or frustration, uncertainty. But mantras are something that can be practiced and can lead the mind towards those states of meditation again. I was once hospitalized many years ago, and I would say that trying to close my eyes to meditate wasn't getting me very far because there was a lot of pain, but mantra practice was still very available. So that was something that helped me through that time. So I think mantra practice is actually, of the Buddhist practices, something that maybe can be done more often and in more spaces than can be seated meditation.
Okay. So all of these things are things that anybody can really do, right? No need for any sort of initiation or ordination.
Yeah, actually, in Japan, you'll walk into temples, and especially in the Shingon tradition, the mantra of the chief deity, whatever main statue is enshrined, that mantra will be written next to the main incense burner, and it really invites the public to come in, offer incense, recite the mantra, and use that as a short meditation. So there isn't, for that kind of basic recitation, there isn't any special permission that's required. Anyone can do it, and I think should be encouraged to.
Okay. In terms of initiations, though, how does that work in Shingon?
So in Shingon, there's usually, for more advanced practices, normally someone would obviously spend some time at a temple or with a particular teacher. So as I would liken it to, if people in the West are coming from a Christian tradition, you might be members of your church and have gathered a certain amount of knowledge about the tradition, and then generated an interest to go further. So they might approach the teacher, the head minister at that temple, and ask to go further. So sometimes just with their permission, they'll begin to teach you more. So there are several temples in the U.S. that for long-term members or people who seem very serious, additional things are taught to them. And then for more advanced practices, somebody may take Tokudo, the initiation. So that is a formal ceremony wherein the person takes vows, but sort of binds himself to that teacher, and pledges sort of a willingness to go forward in the practice and take things a little bit more seriously. So with that, I guess I would describe Tokudo as kind of permission to study. So with that permission, they usually receive a Buddhist name, and at that point become kind of a formal student. So maybe in a simplified American version, you might think of that as your admission letter from the university. So with that, you're going to have access to a little bit more teaching and education, training certain things, and generally in the Japanese tradition, it's more like a formal apprenticeship. So you begin to maybe help with services, different rituals, and in the process of that, there's an educational process that goes with that. So generally, the speed at which that progresses just depends on how much time that temple has, depends on how busy they are, and then also just how much time the student has to give to that practice. But many temples, for long-term members, will give Tokudo to those long-term members. I remember recently that was done in our temple in Brazil. So there was about probably 15 to 20 people who took Tokudo, and they were given some advanced practices, and they began to help out in the services and sit up front and do some more advanced things than if you were to just walk in as a complete newcomer. So that can be very meaningful to people. Often in the Japanese tradition, people don't receive, their Buddhist name until after their death. So it, especially for people who've been involved with the temples for a long time, that becomes a very meaningful kind of step in their practice, in their faith, and their relationship with the temple.
I gotcha. Okay. So let's say someone wants to start a practice now. What is necessary for the basic Shingon practices, the ones that are open to laity at least? Do we need beads, an altar, or?
Well, I would recommend, so I realize that in the Western sense, setting up a full Buddha's altar may be a bit heavy. It may even cause disharmony in a family. So I don't think all of those things are necessary, and everyone should analyze their own situation individually. I had a college professor who was interested in Shingon practice, and I recommended, rather than statuary, that he use the Ajikan scroll, because in the West it may be looked at more as art rather than as religious object. So living in a household with other people who didn't share the same level of interest, it wouldn't be threatening or overtly Buddhist in some way that would maybe cause a reaction in someone else. So I think the first step would be to analyze your situation and ensure that your practice isn't going to cause problems with other people, especially in your household. So that would be kind of counterproductive. So at the very least, maybe set aside a space where some meditation or recitation can be done. And that can be as simple as a corner of a room, or if your space and your situation allows, and setting up a full Buddhist altar. And from there, sourcing either a scroll or statuary that you find some connection with. And as you mentioned, the juzu or beads can be very helpful in counting mantras. Those can be things that people add initially to their practice.
Awesome. Thanks. So we'll wrap up here for this episode, and then for the next one, how about talking about the purpose of all of these practices?
Sure. That sounds like a good idea. I think that's probably, at least in Western languages, a topic that's least available for people. So that would be good.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the teachings.
Thank you. Good to talk to you again, as always.